The voice she heard through the wall was her own name, spoken in the past tense. Eleanor Ashworth pressed her back against the cold stone of the servants' corridor and listened as the Duke of Harrogate lifted his glass in the ballroom beyond and spoke of her as though she were already buried. His words drifted through the narrow gap in the door, calm and practiced, the words of a man who had rehearsed his grief until it sounded like truth. He called her beloved. He called her gone. He asked the room to remember her kindness, her laughter, the light she had brought into his life before the river took her from him. Eleanor did not move. She barely breathed. 3 weeks earlier, she had gone under the black water of the Calder with a hand pressed flat against her back, shoving her from the small boat before she understood what was happening. She remembered the cold closing over her head, the weight of her skirts pulling her down, and then nothing, until she woke in a fisherman's cottage, with a stranger's blanket around her shoulders, and no memory of how she had reached the shore. For 3 weeks, she had stayed hidden, healing, listening to her own thoughts circle the same unanswered question. Who had pushed her, and why? Now she had her answer to at least part of it, and it was worse than she had imagined. The man she was to marry stood in a room full of candles and silk, announcing her death to the very people who had once toasted her engagement, and there was no crack in his voice, no hesitation in his grief. Either the Duke of Harrogate was the finest actor in England, or someone had convinced him so completely of her death that he had never once doubted it. Eleanor closed her eyes and thought of Elias, the fisherman who had pulled her from the current, and never once asked what she was running from. He had begged her not to go back tonight. He had said the water does not forgive twice, and neither might whoever put her in it the first time. She had told him she needed to see the Duke's face when he learned she was alive, because a man's face does not lie the way his voice can. She had not expected to hear him lying to an entire ballroom before she ever reached the door. The music inside swelled, something slow and mournful, chosen no doubt to match the occasion. Glasses clinked. A woman's voice, syrupy with sympathy, said what a tragedy it was, and how young Lady Ashworth had been, and how the Duke bore his loss with such dignity. Eleanor recognized the voice. It belonged to her cousin Margaret, who stood to inherit everything Eleanor owned now that Eleanor was, officially, dead. She thought of the will her father had written before his own passing, the one naming her sole heir to the Ashworth fortune, with only one clause redirecting it elsewhere should she die before her wedding day. She thought of how convenient it was that the boating accident had happened 4 days before that wedding, not 4 days after. She thought of Margaret's calm, steady voice praising a dead woman, and felt something harden in her chest that was not grief at all. Eleanor stepped away from the door and looked down at herself. Her gown was borrowed, plain, nothing like the silks inside, but her back was straight and her hands did not shake anymore. She had spent 3 weeks deciding what she would do when this moment came, and she had decided that she would not scream, and she would not weep, and she would not give anyone the satisfaction of watching her fall apart twice. She pushed the door open and walked into the light. The ballroom did not notice her at first. Heads were bowed, glasses raised, the orchestra holding its mournful note. It was a young footman near the door who saw her first, and the tray in his hands tipped sideways, sending crystal shattering against the marble floor. The sound cut through the music like a blade, and every head in the room turned toward the noise, and then toward her. Eleanor watched the recognition arrive in waves, a gasp near the punch table, a woman's hand flying to her mouth. Somewhere in the back, a man's voice muttered a prayer under his breath. And at the front of the room, glass still raised, the Duke of Harrogate went the color of old parchment and did not move at all. For a long moment nobody spoke. The orchestra faltered into silence, one violin dragging out a note too long before it too gave up. Eleanor stood in the doorway in her plain borrowed gown, her hair unpinned and simple, nothing like the woman they remembered from portraits and engagement announcements, and yet there was no mistaking her face. "Eleanor," the Duke said, and his voice cracked on the second syllable, the first crack she had heard in it all night. She did not answer him immediately. She let her eyes move across the room instead, taking in every face turned toward her, cataloging each reaction the way her father had once taught her to read a room before a negotiation. Shock, genuine shock mostly, but not everywhere. Near the far wall, half hidden behind a pillar draped in black ribbon for the occasion, Margaret's face had gone rigid in a way that had nothing to do with surprise and everything to do with fear. Eleanor filed that away and returned her attention to the Duke. "You buried me rather quickly," she said, and her voice carried further than she expected in the silent room. "I wonder who told you I was dead." The glass slipped from his fingers and shattered at his feet, and still he did not move toward her, as though he feared that crossing the space between them might prove she was not real at all. "They found your shawl," he said, and his voice had gone hoarse. caught on the rocks below the bridge. They searched the river for 2 days. Eleanor, I was told there was no chance, no possibility, that anyone could survive that current, that cold. Who told you that? The question landed harder than she intended, and she watched it land, watched the Duke's mouth open and then close again, watched his eyes flick, just once, toward the pillar where Margaret stood frozen. He had not meant to look. Eleanor was certain of that. But he had looked, and that told her something he had not intended to reveal, something he perhaps did not even know he believed. The magistrate, the Duke said carefully, and your cousin. She was the one who identified the shawl. She said there was no doubt. Margaret stepped forward then, perhaps because staying hidden any longer would have looked worse than facing the room, and arranged her features into an expression of overwhelming relief. Eleanor, she breathed, moving toward her with arms already lifting for an embrace. Thank heaven. We all thought the worst. We mourned you. I have not slept properly in weeks. I'm sure you haven't, Eleanor said, and did not open her arms. Margaret stopped a few feet away, the embrace suspended awkwardly in the air between them, and something flickered behind her eyes before the relieved mask settled back into place. You must be exhausted, she said. Where have you been all this time? We searched everywhere. Did you? Eleanor said. I wonder how thoroughly. A murmur moved through the crowd, guests exchanging glances, sensing something beneath the surface of the conversation that they could not yet name but could certainly feel. The Duke stepped forward at last, closing the distance between himself and Eleanor in 3 long strides, and reached for her hands as though needing to feel that she was solid and warm and real. I don't understand, he said quietly, only for her now, though half the room still strained to hear. Where were you? Why did you not send word? I would have come for you myself, I would have. I could not be certain who was safe to send word to, Eleanor said, and watched his face carefully as she said it. I could not be certain that whoever put me in that river would not try again, the moment they learned I had survived. The Duke went very still. Put you in the river, he repeated slowly, as though testing the shape of the words. Eleanor, you're saying, someone did this to you? This wasn't an accident? No, Eleanor said. It was not an accident. The silence that followed was different from the shocked silence of a moment before. This one had weight to it, the kind of silence that comes when a room full of people realize they are standing inside a story that is not yet finished, and that some of them may be characters in it whether they wish to be or not. Eleanor let the silence stretch, watching faces, watching hands, watching who reached for whom and who stepped quietly back toward the shadows near the wall. She had spent 3 weeks planning what she would say when this moment arrived, and she had decided, in the end, to say very little. Words could be repeated, twisted, denied. What she needed now was not accusation. It was time, and careful watching, and the particular kind of patience that comes to a person who has already been left for dead once, and has no intention of making that mistake again by moving too quickly. I'm tired, she said instead, letting her voice soften just slightly, just enough to seem believable. I would like to rest. We can speak of everything else tomorrow. The Duke did not release her hands. Stay close to me tonight, he said, low enough that only she could hear. Please. Whatever happened to you, whoever did this, I will not let it happen again. Eleanor looked at him for a long moment, searching his face for the answer to the only question that mattered now. Did he know? Had he always known? And simply played his part of grieving fiancé with more skill than she had given him credit for? Or was his shock as real as it looked, his grip on her hands as desperate as it felt? She could not yet be certain. And until she was, she decided, she would let him believe that his closeness was a comfort to her, rather than the very thing she intended to study most closely of all. Behind him, near the pillar, Margaret had gone to stand beside a young man Eleanor did not immediately recognize, someone in the Duke's household livery, and the two of them were speaking in low, urgent tones with their heads bent close together. Eleanor watched them for a moment before the Duke's hand at her elbow guided her toward the door, away from the wreckage of shattered crystal and unraveling grief, and into whatever came next. She had walked out of the river 3 weeks ago believing she had escaped the worst of it. As they passed through the great hall, Eleanor caught her own reflection in a tall gilded mirror, and for a moment she barely knew the woman looking back at her. Pale, thinner than before, with eyes that had learned to watch instead of trust. She thought of Elias, waiting for her return at the edge of the estate as he had promised, and wondered if she had made a mistake in coming back so soon. But the moment had already passed. She was seen now. There was no returning to the quiet safety of the fisherman's cottage, no pretending any longer that the world did not know she lived. Outside, the night air was sharp and cold, and somewhere beyond the hedges a carriage waited that would take her to rooms prepared in haste within the east wing of Kestrel Hall. The Duke walked beside her in silence, his jaw tight, his eyes moving constantly toward the shadows, as though he expected danger to step out from between the trees at any moment. Eleanor found she could not decide whether that watchfulness comforted her or frightened her further. Standing now in the doorway of that ballroom, watching her own cousin whisper urgently to a stranger in the Duke's colors, Eleanor understood with sudden and complete clarity that she had only just begun. Someone had already searched her room by the time Eleanor reached it. She noticed it the moment she stepped through the door of the chamber prepared for her in the east wing. Nothing was dramatically out of place, nothing broken or scattered, but the drawer of the writing desk sat a fraction of an inch further open than it should have, and the small trunk she had left untouched for years had been shifted just slightly from its usual spot against the wall. Someone had been careful. Someone had also been thorough. Eleanor closed the door behind her and stood very still, letting her eyes move across the room the way Elias had taught her to read the surface of the river, before stepping into a boat, searching for what moved beneath what looked calm. She did not call for the Duke. She did not call for anyone. Instead, she crossed to the trunk and opened it herself, running her fingers along the lining until she found what she already suspected might be missing. Her father's letters, the ones detailing the terms of his will, were gone. Eleanor sat on the edge of the bed and allowed herself exactly 1 minute to feel afraid. Then she stood, straightened her borrowed gown, and began to think. Whoever had taken the letters knew this room existed, knew she would be brought here, and had moved quickly enough to search it before she even arrived from the ballroom. That meant someone inside the household, someone with access and authority enough not to be questioned for wandering the east wing. It ruled out most of the staff. It did not rule out Margaret, and it did not rule out the young man in Harrogate livery she had seen speaking with her so urgently near the pillar. A knock came at the door, soft and careful. Eleanor opened it to find not the Duke but an older woman in housekeeper's dress, a tray of tea balanced in her hands and worry written plainly across her face. "I did not believe it," the woman said, setting the tray down with hands that trembled slightly. "When they told the staff you had drowned, I did not believe it for a single day, my lady. You were always too clever for the river." Eleanor studied her, searching for the polish of performance and finding none. "You knew me before," she said. "I was your mother's maid, before I came to serve this house," the woman said. "Mrs. Whitfield, if you remember. I have watched your cousin circle this family since the day your engagement was announced, and I have held my tongue because a woman in my position does not accuse a lady of anything without proof. But I do not trust her, my lady. I never have." Eleanor felt something in her chest loosen slightly, the first small relief since she had stepped into the ballroom. "Tell me what you have seen," she said, and gestured for Mrs. Whitfield to sit. Over the next quarter hour, in careful, quiet sentences, the housekeeper described what she had noticed in the weeks before Eleanor's disappearance. Margaret's frequent visits to Kestrel Hall, always timed for when the Duke was away on estate business. Long conversations between Margaret and a young steward named Harold Finch, conversations that stopped abruptly whenever a servant entered the room, and in the days just after Eleanor was presumed dead, a sudden and unexplained payment made to settle debts that Harold Finch had been quietly accumulating for over a year, debts that should have been far beyond his modest wages to cover. "Where did the money come from?" Eleanor asked, though she suspected she already knew. "Nobody could say for certain," Mrs. Whitfield answered, "but the timing troubled me. Debts vanished the very week you did." Eleanor turned the information over carefully in her mind. If Margaret had access to funds that should not yet have existed, funds that could only have come from an inheritance not yet legally settled, then either Margaret believed with absolute certainty that Eleanor would never return to contest it, or someone had assured her of exactly that. "Does the Duke know of this?" Eleanor asked. Mrs. Whitfield hesitated, and the hesitation told Eleanor everything before the woman even spoke. "His Grace trusts your cousin," she said carefully. "She has been a comfort to him these past weeks, my lady. Grief makes people trust more easily than they should." After the housekeeper left, Eleanor sat alone with her tea growing cold beside her and allowed herself to consider, fully and honestly, the possibility that the Duke himself was not entirely innocent in this, too. Perhaps he had not pushed her into the river with his own hands. But grief that convenient, comfort arriving that precisely from the one person with the most to gain from her death, was the kind of coincidence her father had taught her never to trust. She thought of Elias again, waiting somewhere at the edge of the estate, as he had insisted on doing despite her protests, refusing to leave until he knew she was safely inside. She had told him she would send word if she needed him. She had not expected to need him again quite this soon. The following morning, Eleanor descended to the breakfast room early, before the household had fully woken, hoping to observe rather than be observed. She found Margaret already there, seated alone at the long table with a cup of chocolate untouched before her, staring out the window with an expression Eleanor had never before seen on her cousin's face. Not grief, not relief, calculation. Margaret startled slightly when Eleanor entered, recovering quickly into a warm smile that did not reach her eyes. "You're awake early," she said. "I hope you slept well after everything." "Well enough," Eleanor said, taking the seat across from her with deliberate calm. "Though I find myself troubled by something. My father's letters have gone missing from my trunk, the ones concerning his will." She watched Margaret's hand tighten fractionally around the cup of chocolate before releasing again. "How strange," Margaret said. "Perhaps they were misplaced during the search for you. The staff went through every room in the house looking for any clue to where you might have gone." "Perhaps," Eleanor said, though her tone made clear she did not believe it. "It is odd, though. I would have expected such important documents to have been kept safe rather than lost in a search." "Grief makes people careless," Margaret said smoothly. "I'm sure they will turn up." Eleanor let the silence stretch a moment longer than comfortable, before changing the subject entirely, asking after Margaret's own health, her recent travels, small pleasantries designed to lower her cousin's guard rather than raise it further. She learned, through careful and patient questioning, that Margaret had been staying at Kestrel Hall almost continuously since Eleanor's disappearance, a guest of the Duke's own invitation, her presence explained as comfort to a grieving household. It was, Eleanor thought, a remarkably convenient arrangement for a woman who stood to inherit everything the moment her cousin's death was made final and legal. Later that day, Eleanor sought out Harold Finch, the young steward Mrs. Whitfield had named, and found him in the estate office reviewing account books with an intensity that suggested a man trying very hard to appear busy. He startled when she entered, closing the ledger a fraction too quickly. "My lady," he said, rising and bowing stiffly, "I am glad to see you return safely." "Are you?" Eleanor said, watching him carefully. "I understand you were of great help to my cousin during my absence." "Settling certain matters." Something flickered across his face, there and gone so quickly she might have imagined it had she not been watching for exactly that reaction. "I only did what any steward would do, my lady, managing the household in difficult times." "Of course," Eleanor said, and let him believe the conversation had ended there, though she left the office with a name and a face to add to the list forming carefully in her mind. That evening, the Duke found her walking alone in the garden, and something in his expression suggested he too had spent the day thinking rather than resting. He fell into step beside her, without speaking for a long moment, and when he finally did speak, his voice carried none of the desperate warmth from the night before. "I have been told your father's letters are missing," he said, "and that you believe someone in this house searched your room." Eleanor glanced at him, surprised he had learned this so quickly, and wondered which servant had carried the news to him, and whether that servant could be trusted, or had simply told the story to whoever asked. "I do believe that, yes," she said carefully. "Then we are in agreement about at least one thing," the Duke said quietly. "I do not believe your accident in that river was an accident at all, and I intend to learn who is responsible, Eleanor, whatever it costs me to learn it." She studied his face in the fading evening light, searching once more for the crack in his composure that would tell her whether his words were truth or performance, and found, for the first time since she had walked back into his life, that she could not tell the difference at all. "Then help me understand something," she said, choosing her next words with great care. "The night I disappeared, who first suggested that the river had taken me? Who convinced the household there was no hope of finding me alive?" The Duke's jaw tightened, and he was quiet long enough that Eleanor began to wonder if he would answer at all. "Your cousin," he said finally. "She came to me herself, before the search parties had even finished combing the banks. She said she had spoken with a fisherman downstream, who claimed to have seen a body carried past the old mill, and that the currents there were known to be merciless. I sent men to search regardless, but after 2 days, with nothing found but your shawl, I began to believe there was no other explanation." Eleanor absorbed this slowly, turning it over the way she might turn over a stone to see what lived beneath it. "And this fisherman," she said. "Did anyone ever speak with him directly? Did anyone learn his name?" "I do not know," the Duke admitted. "Margaret said she had heard it secondhand, from one of the estate workers who had gone to fetch water near the mill." "Then it is a story with no one at its source," Eleanor said quietly. "A rumor with no origin, arriving at precisely the moment it was needed to end the search." The Duke stopped walking, and turned to face her fully. And in the dim light Eleanor could see something shift behind his eyes, some door swinging open onto a room he had perhaps refused to enter until now. "You believe she invented it," he said. "Not merely benefited from your absence, but engineered the story that ended any hope of finding you." "I believe," Eleanor said carefully, "that it would be foolish of me not to consider it." They walked in silence after that, past the hedges trimmed into careful shapes, past the fountain that had run dry for the winter, and Eleanor found herself grateful for the quiet, grateful for a moment to simply exist, without needing to measure every word for its effect on the person beside her. The Duke, for his part, seemed lost in thoughts of his own, his hands clasped tightly behind his back, his stride slower than usual, as though the weight of what he was beginning to understand had settled into his very bones. "There is something else," he said eventually, breaking the silence. "Something I have not told anyone, not even the magistrate. 2 nights before you disappeared, I received a letter, unsigned, warning me that my engagement to you would end in tragedy if I did not reconsider it. I dismissed it as the work of some jealous rival or bitter tenant. I did not think to connect it to what happened after." Eleanor felt a chill move through her that had nothing to do with the evening air. "You kept this letter?" "I did," the Duke said. "I could show it to you tonight if you wish." "I do wish it," Eleanor said. "Very much." They returned to the house together, and in the privacy of his study, with the door firmly closed and a single lamp burning low against the darkness outside, the Duke produced a folded letter from a locked drawer and placed it in her hands. The handwriting was unfamiliar, deliberately disguised in places, the ink slightly smudged as though written in haste. The warning inside was vague but unmistakable in its intent, and Eleanor read it twice before setting it down on the desk between them. "This was written by someone who knew the wedding date," she said. "Someone close enough to the household to know such details before they were widely announced." "Yes," the Duke said grimly. "I have thought of little else since you returned to me last night." Eleanor looked up at him then, and for the first time since stepping back into his life, she allowed herself to consider that perhaps he was not her enemy after all, that perhaps grief and deception had blinded him, just as thoroughly as they had nearly succeeded in destroying her. It did not mean she trusted him completely. It meant only that she was willing, for now, to let him stand beside her instead of against her, while the truth of what had happened continued to take shape in the shadows of Kestrel Hall. "We will need to be careful," she said. "Whoever wrote this letter, whoever pushed me into that river, believes the matter is finished. We must not give them reason to suspect otherwise until we know enough to act." The Duke nodded slowly, folding the letter once more, and returning it to its drawer. "Then we watch," he said. "Together, this time." Eleanor did not answer immediately. She thought of Margaret's calculating stare over untouched chocolate, of Harold Finch's quickly closed ledger, of a fisherman downstream who might never have existed at all. "Together," the Duke had said, and she found herself wanting to believe it, even as some careful, guarded part of her continued to hold the word at arm's length, waiting to see whether it would prove itself true. The hand on her back had smelled of lavender before it pushed her into the dark. Eleanor woke before dawn with the memory sharp and sudden in her mind, more vivid than it had ever been in the weeks since the river had nearly taken her life. She lay still in the unfamiliar bed of Kestrel Hall, staring at the ceiling, chasing the fragment before it could slip away again. Lavender. Not the heavy, common lavender soap used by most of the staff, but something finer, something she associated with a particular dressing table in a particular room she had visited many times before her engagement to the Duke. Margaret wore lavender. Eleanor sat up in the darkness, her heart beating fast, and forced herself to breathe slowly, to examine the memory the way her father had taught her to examine any piece of evidence, without allowing hope or fear to color what she actually knew. A scent alone was not proof. Lavender was not so rare a fragrance that only one woman in England might wear it, but combined with everything else, the convenient rumor of a body swept past the mill, the unexplained payment of debts, the missing letters, the memory settled into place like another stone in a wall slowly being built. She thought again of the night itself, working backward through what she could recall. The small boat on the river, taken out at Margaret's own suggestion for what her cousin had called a farewell outing before the wedding, just the two of them, a chance to speak as sisters one final time before Eleanor's life changed forever. Eleanor remembered laughing at something Margaret had said. She remembered turning to look at the darkening sky. She remembered the hand. By the time the sun rose fully over Kestrel Hall, Eleanor had decided she needed to speak with the one person who might be able to tell her more about that night than her own damaged memory could offer. She needed to find Elias. She dressed quietly and slipped from the house before most of the household had woken, following the path toward the river that she had walked back from 3 weeks earlier, disoriented and half convinced she was dreaming. The path was familiar in a way that unsettled her, the bend where the trees grew close together, the old stone bridge where fishermen sometimes cast their lines in the early morning quiet. She found Elias exactly where she expected, seated on an overturned crate near the water's edge, mending a net with hands that moved with practiced ease, even as his eyes lifted immediately toward her approach. "You came back sooner than I hoped," he said, setting the net aside and rising to meet her. "I have been watching the road every morning since you left for that house. I did not like the way you spoke last night, my lady. Too calm. People who plan too calmly are usually the ones most afraid." Eleanor allowed herself a small, tired smile. "You read people too well for a man who spends his days alone with fish." "I read the river," Elias said. "People are not so different once you learn what to watch for. Now tell me what has happened, and do not leave anything out, because I did not save you from that water, only to watch you walk back into whatever pushed you there in the first place." Eleanor sat beside him on a second crate and told him everything: the missing letters, the housekeeper's careful account, the steward's suspicious ledger, the unsigned warning letter kept locked in the Duke's own drawer, and finally, the memory that had surfaced only that morning, the scent of lavender on the hand that had shoved her from the boat. Elias listened without interrupting, his weathered face growing more serious with each detail, until she finished and silence settled between them, broken only by the gentle sound of water moving against the bank. "Lavender," he said finally. "That is thin evidence for what you are suggesting, my lady." "I know," Eleanor said, "but it is not the only evidence. It is simply the piece that finally lets the rest of it make sense." Elias was quiet for a long moment, staring out at the river as though it might offer him some counsel of its own. "There is something I did not tell you before," he said eventually. "When I pulled you from the water that night, you were not alone in the river for long before I reached you. I saw another boat, further downstream, moving away from the bridge rather than toward it. I did not think much of it at the time. I was too busy trying to keep your head above the current. But I remember it now, because it makes no sense for a boat to be moving away from someone drowning unless the person in it already knew there was no one left to save." Eleanor felt her pulse quicken. "Could you see who was in the boat?" "Too dark, and too far," Elias admitted. "But I remember it was a single figure, rowing quickly, moving with purpose rather than panic. Someone fleeing, not searching. It was not proof, not the kind that would satisfy a magistrate or stand before a court, but it confirmed what Eleanor had already begun to suspect in the quiet hours before dawn. She had not simply fallen from the boat by accident, struck her head, and drifted helplessly downstream. Someone had pushed her deliberately and then rowed away without looking back, confident enough in the outcome that they had not felt the need to confirm it. "I need to find a way to prove this," Eleanor said, more to herself than to Elias. "Suspicion is not enough. Margaret will simply deny everything, and without proof, the Duke may find himself torn between believing me and believing the woman who has spent 3 weeks comforting him in my absence." "Then let me help you," Elias said. "I know this river better than any man in the county. If there was a second boat that night, someone would have seen it dock somewhere along the bank. Boats do not vanish into thin air, my lady. Give me a few days and I will learn where it came from and where it went." Eleanor studied him carefully. This quiet, steady man who had asked for nothing in return for saving her life, who had nursed her back to health in secret, and never once pressed her for answers she was not ready to give. She thought of how different his patience was from the careful, calculated warmth of everyone she had encountered since walking back into Kestrel Hall, and felt a rare and unguarded gratitude settle over her. "Thank you," she said simply. "I do not know how I will ever repay what you have already done for me." "You can repay me by staying alive long enough to see justice done," Elias said, with the ghost of a smile that did not quite reach his tired eyes. "That will be payment enough." Eleanor returned to Kestrel Hall before the household had fully risen, slipping back into her room unnoticed, or so she believed until she found Mrs. Whitfield waiting for her just inside the door, worry etched across her weathered face. "You must be more careful, my lady," the housekeeper said quietly, closing the door behind them both. "One of the stable hands mentioned seeing you walk toward the river this morning. If word of that reaches the wrong ears, it may raise questions you are not yet ready to answer." "Who did the stable hand mention it to?" Eleanor asked, feeling a familiar tightness return to her chest. "Only to me, as far as I know," Mrs. Whitfield said. "I told him he must have been mistaken, that you had likely gone walking in the garden instead. But my lady, if you intend to continue meeting with whoever helped you these past weeks, You must find a way to do so without being seen. This house has more eyes and ears than you might expect, and not all of them belong to people you can trust." Eleanor nodded, grateful once again for the older woman's quiet loyalty, and resolved to be more careful in the days ahead. She spent the remainder of the morning in her room, claiming exhaustion from the previous night's events, and used the solitude to think through everything she had learned, arranging the pieces of the puzzle in her mind, like a hand of cards she was not yet ready to reveal. That afternoon, a note arrived for her, delivered by a young maid who would not meet her eyes as she handed it over. Eleanor unfolded the paper and found a single line written in an unfamiliar hand, the letters formed with the same careful disguise she had noticed in the warning letter the Duke had shown her the night before. "Some graves should not be disturbed," the note read. "Return to the water before someone helps you back into it." Eleanor's hands went cold as she read it a second time, then a third, searching for anything that might tell her who had sent it. The paper was ordinary, the kind used throughout the household for everyday correspondence. The ink was fresh. Whoever had written this note had done so recently, and had access to Kestrel Hall's own writing supplies, which meant the threat had originated from somewhere inside the very walls meant to keep her safe. She thought immediately of showing it to the Duke, and then hesitated, remembering Mrs. Whitfield's warning about eyes and ears she could not yet identify. If the note had come from someone close to him, revealing it too quickly might only alert them that she suspected the danger was internal rather than external. She decided instead to keep the note hidden, folded carefully into the lining of her trunk alongside the few possessions she had managed to keep safe from prying eyes, and to say nothing until she had gathered enough proof to make an accusation that could not be dismissed or denied. That evening, as the household gathered for dinner, Eleanor watched every face at the table with new and careful attention, searching for any flicker of guilt or satisfaction that might betray the note's author. Margaret ate with her usual composed grace, offering polite conversation about the weather and asking after Eleanor's health with what appeared to be genuine concern. Harold Finch sat further down the table, quiet and watchful, speaking only when addressed directly. The Duke, for his part, seemed distracted throughout the meal, his eyes occasionally drifting toward Eleanor with an expression she could not quite decipher, somewhere between worry and something softer that she did not yet trust herself to name. It was not until much later that night, as Eleanor prepared for bed, that she heard the soft knock at her door and opened it to find Elias standing in the shadows of the hallway, his expression grim, his clothes damp from the evening air. "I found the place where the second boat came ashore," he said quietly, glancing over his shoulder to ensure they were not observed. "And I found something else there too, my lady, something you will want to see for yourself, before this house decides to bury the truth as thoroughly as they tried to bury you." Eleanor did not hesitate. She threw a dark shawl over her shoulders and followed him down the servants' stairs, out through a side door that Mrs. Whitfield had shown her earlier that day, one seldom used and rarely watched. The night was cold and clear, the moon bright enough to light their path without need for a lantern, and Eleanor found herself grateful for the darkness that swallowed them both as they moved quickly away from the house and toward the tree line beyond the gardens. "How far is it?" she asked, keeping her voice low. "Not far," Elias said. "There is a narrow inlet downstream from the old mill, hidden by reeds, the kind of place a man might choose if he wanted to bring a boat ashore without being seen from the main path. I spent the better part of the day walking the bank, asking a few careful questions of the men who fish that stretch of water, until one of them remembered seeing a small boat tied there the very night you disappeared. He assumed it belonged to a poacher and thought nothing more of it." They walked in silence after that, following a narrow trail that wound along the river's edge, the water dark and silver beneath the moonlight, until the sound of the current grew softer, and the reeds grew thick around them. Elias slowed his pace and gestured toward a small clearing hidden from the main path by a curtain of overhanging branches. "Here," he said quietly. Eleanor stepped forward and saw immediately what had drawn his attention. A length of rope, still tied to the trunk of a low tree, the kind used to secure a small boat against the current, and caught in the reeds nearby, half buried in mud, a single glove, delicate and clearly belonging to a woman of some means, the fine leather now stained and ruined by weeks in the water. She knelt and lifted the glove carefully, turning it over in her hands, and felt her breath catch as she noticed the small embroidered initials stitched into the cuff, faded but still legible in the moonlight. "M.A. Margaret Ashworth," Eleanor whispered. "I did not want to be the one to tell you," Elias said quietly. "I only wanted you to see it with your own eyes, so that no one could ever tell you afterward that you imagined it, or that grief had led you to see what was not truly there." Eleanor sat back on her heels, the ruined glove still clutched in her hand, and felt the last fragile doubt she had been holding on to finally give way. She had wanted, in some small and foolish corner of her heart, to be wrong about her cousin. They had grown up together, shared a nursery, whispered secrets to one another as girls who believed the world held nothing more dangerous than a strict governess or a missed birthday. To know now, with this small piece of ruined leather as proof, that Margaret had not simply benefited from her death but had orchestrated it herself, felt like losing something she had not realized she still carried. "We cannot bring this glove to the Duke," Eleanor said finally, forcing her voice steady. "Not yet. Margaret will simply claim it was lost long before that night, or that someone else planted it here to frame her. We need more than a glove and a memory of lavender. We need something that cannot be explained away." "Then what will you do?" Elias asked. Eleanor thought for a long moment, turning the glove over once more in her hands before carefully wrapping it in a fold of her shawl to keep it safe. "I will need to find whoever helped her that night," she said slowly. "A woman does not simply row a boat alone through darkness and cold currents without knowing the water well enough to navigate it safely. Margaret has never shown any skill or interest in boats before this. Someone taught her, or someone else was in that second boat with her." "Harold Finch," Elias said. "The steward you mentioned. A man who settles debts with money that should not yet exist, and who grew up, if I remember rightly from asking around the village, in a family of boatmen along this very stretch of river." Eleanor felt the final piece settle into place with a quiet, terrible certainty. "He would know these waters as well as you do," she said, "perhaps better. And he would have every reason to help Margaret in exchange for a share of the fortune she believed she was about to inherit." They stood together in the small clearing for a long moment, the weight of what they had uncovered settling heavily between them, before Elias finally spoke again, his voice gentle but firm. "You must be very careful now, my lady. If they suspect you are close to the truth, they will not hesitate to try again, and next time I may not be near enough to pull you from the water before it is too late." "I know," Eleanor said quietly, "but I did not survive that river only to spend the rest of my life pretending I do not know what happened to me. I would rather face the danger with my eyes open than live safely in ignorance." Elias studied her for a long moment in the moonlight, something like admiration and worry mingling in his weathered face. "Your father would have been proud of you," he said finally. "Whatever else may be said of this house and the people in it, you have not lost yourself, my lady." "That is no small thing." They made their way back to Kestrel Hall in careful silence, the ruined glove hidden safely within the folds of Eleanor's shawl, and as she slipped back through the side door and up the narrow servants' stairs to her waiting room, Eleanor found herself thinking not of fear, but of the quiet, steady resolve settling over her like armor. She had spent 3 weeks hiding from the truth of what had happened to her. She did not intend to spend a single day longer hiding from what she now needed to do about it. The glove sat hidden in Eleanor's trunk for 3 days before she decided how to use it. She spent those days playing a careful role, appearing tired but recovering, gracious but reserved, giving Margaret and Harold Finch no reason to suspect she knew more than she let show. She smiled at her cousin over breakfast. She thanked the steward politely when he brought papers for her signature regarding the estate. She let the household believe that Lady Ashworth, having survived a terrible ordeal, simply wished for peace and quiet as she recovered her strength. It was, she knew, the most difficult performance of her life, made bearable only by the small satisfaction of knowing that every day she waited, every day she gathered more information, brought her closer to a reckoning her cousin did not see coming. The Duke, for his part, had grown quieter and more watchful in the days since showing her the warning letter locked in his study. He no longer left her alone for long stretches, finding reasons to walk with her in the garden, to sit near her during meals, to check in on her welfare with a frequency that felt less like affection and more like vigilance. Eleanor could not decide whether this comforted her or troubled her further. A man determined to protect her, and a man determined to watch her closely enough to control what she discovered might, from the outside, look identical. On the 4th morning, Eleanor decided the time had come to test him directly. She found him alone in his study, reviewing correspondence at his desk, and closed the door behind her with deliberate care. "I need to speak with you about something important," she said, "and I need you to listen without interrupting until I have finished." The Duke set down his pen immediately, giving her his full attention. "Of course," he said. "What is it?" Eleanor took a slow breath and began the story she had carefully constructed over the previous night, a story built not entirely on truth but on a calculated blend of fact and invention, designed to draw out a reaction from whoever might be listening beyond the study door. "I believe my memory of that night is returning," she said. "Fragments at first, but they are becoming clearer each day. I remember now who was in the boat with me. I remember whose hand pushed me into the water. The Duke's face went pale, and he leaned forward across the desk, his hands gripping its edge. Who? He demanded. Eleanor, tell me who did this to you, and I will see them answer for it, whatever the cost. I am not yet certain enough to say the name aloud, Eleanor said carefully, watching his reaction with close attention. The memory is still incomplete, but I believe, within a few days, I will have enough clarity to be certain. I intend to speak with the magistrate once I am confident in what I remember. It was, of course, entirely untrue. Eleanor's memory had returned to her days ago, in the quiet hours after finding the glove by the river, and she had already formed her certainty about who had pushed her into the water. But a false rumor of returning memory, planted carefully and allowed to spread through the household by whatever channels carried gossip fastest, would serve a different purpose entirely. It would force whoever was guilty to panic, to make a mistake, to reveal themselves through fear rather than patience. The Duke studied her for a long moment, something unreadable moving behind his eyes. You trust me enough to tell me this, he said slowly, but not enough to give me the name itself. I trust very few people completely right now, Eleanor said honestly. You must understand why. I was betrayed by someone close enough to arrange a private outing on the river, someone I had known and trusted for most of my life. Forgive me if that has made me cautious with everyone, including you. Something flickered across the Duke's face, a flash of hurt quickly suppressed, and Eleanor felt an unexpected pang of guilt at causing it, even knowing the deception served a necessary purpose. I understand, he said finally, though his voice carried a note of quiet sadness. I only wish you knew you could trust me completely, Eleanor. I have done nothing but search for the truth since the moment you walked back into that ballroom. I want to believe that, Eleanor said, and found, to her own surprise, that the words were entirely true. She left the study soon after, satisfied that the seed had been planted, and spent the remainder of the day watching carefully for any sign of the rumors spread through the household. By evening, she noticed the first small changes. Margaret's usual composure seemed slightly strained during dinner, her conversation less fluid than before, her eyes drifting toward Eleanor more frequently than usual with an expression that might have passed for concern to anyone not watching as closely as Eleanor herself. Harold Finch excused himself early from the table, claiming urgent estate business, though Eleanor noted he had shown no such urgency in the days before. It was 2 days later, as Eleanor walked alone through the eastern gardens in the late afternoon light, that Margaret finally approached her directly, her careful composure cracking just slightly at the edges. I heard you have been remembering more of that night, Margaret said, falling into step beside her with an attempt at casual conversation that did not quite land. I hope you know how relieved I am, cousin. It must be such a comfort, finally understanding what happened to you. It is, Eleanor said simply, offering nothing more. Have you spoken with the magistrate yet? Margaret asked, and Eleanor noted the slight tremor beneath the question, carefully controlled but not entirely hidden. Not yet, Eleanor said. I want to be certain of every detail before I make any accusations. It would be terrible to name the wrong person out of confusion or haste. Margaret's hand tightened briefly around the fabric of her skirt before releasing. Of course, she said, that seems wise. They walked in silence for a few moments longer, before Margaret spoke again, her voice carefully casual, in a way that failed to disguise the tension beneath it. I do hope, whatever you remember, that you will consider how difficult these past weeks have been for everyone who loves you. Grief can make people see things that are not entirely accurate. I would hate for you to accuse someone wrongly, only to regret it later. Eleanor turned to look at her cousin directly, letting a fraction of the coldness she felt show through her careful mask. I do not intend to accuse anyone without absolute certainty, she said. But when I am certain, Margaret, I will not hesitate, regardless of who that certainty points toward. Something in Margaret's face shifted then, just for an instant, a flash of something colder and harder than the concerned relative she had been playing for weeks, before the mask slid back into place. I only want you safe, cousin, she said. That is all I have ever wanted. Eleanor did not believe her, and something in her own expression must have made that clear, because Margaret excused herself soon after, walking quickly back toward the house with a stiffness in her posture that had not been there before their conversation began. That evening, Eleanor received a second note, delivered again by a maid too frightened to meet her eyes, the handwriting matching the first threat she had received days earlier. This one was shorter, more urgent, the careful disguise of the handwriting slightly less controlled than before, as though written in haste and fear rather than calm deliberation. You remember nothing, the note read. Say so publicly, or the next accident will not leave room for a fisherman to save you. Eleanor read the note twice, her hands steady despite the cold fear settling in her stomach, and understood immediately what it meant. Someone believed her false claim of returning memory, and that belief had frightened them enough to escalate their threats. It was, in its own way, exactly the reaction she had hoped for, confirmation that her plan was working, even as it brought a very real danger closer to her door. She thought of showing this note to the Duke as well, and once again hesitated, uncertain whether doing so would help her, or simply narrow the circle of who might be warned that she was closing in on the truth. Instead, she found Mrs. Whitfield later that night and showed her both notes together, watching the older woman's face grow pale with concern as she read them. "You must tell His Grace," Mrs. Whitfield said firmly. "Whatever your reasons for caution, my lady, this has gone beyond anything you should face alone. If something were to happen to you now, with proof this clear sitting hidden in your trunk, the truth might never come to light at all." Eleanor considered this carefully, weighing the housekeeper's counsel against her own instinct for patience and careful observation, and found, in the end, that she could not entirely disagree. The threats were escalating. Whoever had pushed her into the river once would not hesitate to try again if they believed their freedom depended on it. "You are right," Eleanor said finally. "I will tell him. But I need one more piece of proof first, something that will make an accusation impossible to deny or explain away. Elias believes he can find where Harold Finch learned to navigate these waters so skillfully, evidence that connects him directly to Margaret's plan rather than simple coincidence." "And if you do not find it in time," Mrs. Whitfield asked quietly, "before whoever sent these notes decides to act on their threats?" Eleanor did not have an answer for that question, and the silence that followed felt heavier than any words could have expressed. She thought of the glove hidden in her trunk, of the rope tied to a tree by a hidden inlet, of a hand smelling of lavender pushing her into cold, dark water. She had survived that night through nothing more than luck and a fisherman's watchful eyes. She was not certain she would be so fortunate a second time, and for the first time since walking back into Kestrel Hall, Eleanor allowed herself to feel, fully and completely, just how much danger still surrounded her. Mrs. Whitfield left soon after, promising to keep careful watch over the household in the days ahead, and to alert Eleanor immediately to anything unusual. Alone in her room, Eleanor sat by the window for a long while, watching the darkness settle over the gardens below, turning the two threatening notes over in her mind, and searching for any detail she might have overlooked. The handwriting on both notes matched, disguised in the same careful manner, but something about the second note troubled her more deeply than the first. The urgency in it, the slight unsteadiness in certain letters, suggested a hand under greater strain than before. Whoever had written it was afraid, and fear, Eleanor knew from long observation of her father's business dealings, made people reckless in ways calm calculation never did. She thought of Margaret's tightened grip on her skirts in the garden that afternoon, of the flash of something colder beneath her cousin's careful concern, and wondered whether Margaret herself had written these notes, or whether Harold Finch, growing desperate as suspicion closed in around him, had taken it upon himself to act without waiting for his accomplice's approval. The distinction mattered more than it might have seemed. A steward acting alone out of fear might be reasoned with, or frightened into confession. A cousin who had orchestrated murder for the sake of inheritance would not likely be moved by anything so simple as reason. The next morning brought a small development that Eleanor had not anticipated. A letter arrived for her, this one carrying an official seal from the county magistrate's office, informing her that given the extraordinary circumstances of her return, a formal inquiry would be opened into the events surrounding her presumed death. The magistrate himself intended to visit Kestrel Hall within the week, to take statements from the household. Eleanor read the letter twice, weighing what this meant for her careful plan. An official inquiry would bring scrutiny she could not fully control, questions asked by someone with no stake in protecting either her interests or the household's reputation. It might accelerate the truth coming to light. It might also, she worried, give Margaret and Harold Finch time to prepare their answers, to destroy whatever evidence remained before the magistrate arrived to examine it. She sought out Elias again that same afternoon, meeting him at their usual spot near the river, and showed him the magistrate's letter along with the second threatening note she had received. "This changes things," Elias said, reading both documents with a furrowed brow. "If the magistrate arrives before we have proof strong enough to present, whoever is guilty may simply deny everything, and without the glove or some clearer evidence connecting Finch to that night, it will become your word against theirs, a word that has already been publicly declared dead once before. Some may wonder if grief and shock have confused your memory rather than sharpened it." "Then we have less time than I hoped," Eleanor said, feeling the weight of the coming days settle heavily upon her. "I have been asking further along the river," Elias said. A boat builder 2 villages downstream remembers repairing a small vessel for Harold Finch some months back, work done quietly and paid for in coin rather than through the estate accounts. It is not proof of murder, but it establishes that Finch kept a boat of his own, skilled enough to maintain and navigate it, contrary to whatever he might claim if questioned. Eleanor felt a small flicker of hope at this news, another piece settling into the growing case against the 2 people she now believed responsible for nearly ending her life. Will the boat builder speak to the magistrate directly? I believe he will, if approached properly and offered some assurance he will not suffer for it afterward, Elias said. Men in his position often fear entanglement with matters involving the wealthy and titled. He will need convincing that speaking the truth will not cost him his livelihood. Then we must convince him, Eleanor said firmly, before the magistrate arrives, if possible. I would rather walk into that inquiry with every piece of proof already gathered than hope the truth reveals itself under official questioning alone. Elias nodded, already turning over plans of his own. I will speak with him again tomorrow, he said, and I will bring word of whatever I learn as quickly as I am able. In the meantime, my lady, please heed the warning in that note, at least outwardly. Let them believe you are cautious, frightened even. A predator grows careless when it believes its prey has stopped watching. Eleanor considered this advice carefully as she made her way back to Kestrel Hall that evening, resolving to play the part of a woman cowed by threat rather than emboldened by it, at least for the few remaining days before the magistrate's arrival could bring the matter, one way or another, to its conclusion. The boat builder agreed to speak, but only after Elias promised him protection he had no legal power to give. Eleanor learned this 2 days later, when Elias arrived at Kestrel Hall in broad daylight for the first time, no longer concerned with hiding his visits now that the household's attention had turned toward preparations for the magistrate's imminent arrival. He found her in the garden, walking alone as she often did in the early afternoon, and delivered his news with the careful satisfaction of a man who had accomplished something difficult. His name is Samuel Pratt, Elias said, a boat builder in the village of Marsden, 2 hours downriver. He confirmed everything. Harold Finch commissioned a small skiff from him nearly a year ago, paid in coin, and insisted the work be kept quiet. Pratt assumed at the time it was simply a man wanting privacy for fishing trips away from his employer's watchful eye. He thought nothing more of it until I explained why I was asking. Will he testify to the magistrate? Eleanor asked, her heart beating faster with cautious hope. He has agreed, provided he is not made to travel far from his own village, and provided his name is not dragged through scandal beyond what is necessary, Elias said. I believe the promise of coin from your own estate, once matters are settled, helped ease his hesitation considerably. Eleanor allowed herself a small, tired smile. Then we have Finch's boat, his skill with the river, and now a witness who can place both firmly outside the estate's official records, hidden precisely as a guilty man might hide such things. We have enough to raise serious questions, Elias said carefully. Whether it is enough to prove murder beyond any doubt, I cannot say. That will depend on how skillfully the magistrate presses them, and how far Margaret and Finch are willing to lie to protect themselves. Eleanor nodded, already turning her mind toward the final piece of her plan, one she had been considering carefully since the magistrate's letter first arrived. Then we will not wait for the magistrate to press them at all, she said. We will do it ourselves, first, in front of witnesses who cannot later be dismissed as biased or mistaken. I intend to hold a gathering, much like the one at which I first returned, and I intend to force the truth into the open before official questioning ever begins. Elias studied her with visible concern. That is a dangerous plan, my lady. If you corner them publicly, and they panic rather than confess, there is no telling what either of them might do. I am aware of the danger, Eleanor said quietly, but I have spent weeks now watching, waiting, gathering evidence one careful piece at a time, and I find I am tired of being patient. I would rather face this directly, on my own terms, with proof already in hand, than wait for a magistrate who may or may not press hard enough to find the truth beneath their lies. That evening, Eleanor spoke with the Duke, revealing at last the full extent of what she and Elias had uncovered together. She showed him the ruined glove with its embroidered initials, the 2 threatening notes, and explained what Elias had learned from the boat builder in Marsden. The Duke listened in grim silence, his hands clenched tightly on the arms of his chair, and when she finished, he sat quietly for a long moment before speaking. Margaret, he said finally, the name heavy with disbelief and something close to grief. I trusted her. I let her stay in this house, comfort me in my supposed loss, manage household matters in your absence, and all the while she had arranged your death and profited from the deception. I believe so, Eleanor said carefully, though I do not yet know if she acted entirely alone, or whether someone else guided her hand as well. The Duke's eyes sharpened at this. What do you mean? Eleanor hesitated, choosing her next words with great care. The letters warning you of tragedy before our wedding, written before I ever disappeared. Margaret would have had motive to write them herself, planting doubt in your mind in case her plan somehow failed, but I have wondered whether she had help in constructing such an elaborate deception. Managing an inheritance this large, settling debts through Finch without drawing attention from the estate's own accountants, requires more careful planning than I believe Margaret possesses on her own. The Duke was quiet for a long moment, something troubled moving behind his eyes. You suspect someone else, he said, someone with greater knowledge of the estate's finances than either Margaret or Finch would have. I do not yet know who, Eleanor admitted, but I intend to find out, tomorrow evening, when I gather the household together and reveal what we have learned. The gathering was arranged quickly, framed to the household as a small dinner to celebrate Eleanor's continued recovery, an occasion for the family and closest members of the estate to share a meal together before the magistrate's arrival brought more formal proceedings. Eleanor spent the day preparing carefully, reviewing every piece of evidence with Elias one final time, rehearsing in her mind exactly how she intended the evening to unfold. By evening, the dining hall at Kestrel Hall had been arranged much as it had been the night of Eleanor's dramatic return. Candles burning low along the long table, the household gathered in their finest evening dress, though the mood carried none of the celebratory warmth of that earlier night. Margaret sat near the Duke's right hand, her composure carefully maintained despite the visible strain around her eyes. Harold Finch sat further down the table, quiet and watchful, his hands occasionally straying to adjust his collar as though it had grown too tight. Eleanor waited until the meal had been served and the initial pleasantries exchanged before rising slowly from her seat, drawing every eye in the room toward her. I would like to share something with all of you tonight, she said, her voice steady despite the pounding of her own heart. Something I have learned about the night I was presumed drowned in the river. The room fell silent, forks pausing halfway to mouths, conversation dying mid-sentence. Margaret's hand tightened almost imperceptibly around her wineglass. For weeks I believed my fall into that river was simply a terrible accident, Eleanor continued, but I have since learned otherwise. I was pushed, deliberately, by someone I trusted completely, someone who wore lavender scent and had every reason to see me disappear before my wedding could secure my inheritance beyond her reach. Gasps rippled around the table. Margaret's face had gone rigid, pale beneath the candlelight, though she said nothing, her eyes darting briefly toward Harold Finch before returning to Eleanor with forced composure. I do not know what accusation you intend to make, cousin, Margaret said, her voice carrying a brittle edge beneath its careful calm, but I hope you understand how deeply hurtful such suggestions are, coming from someone I have loved and cared for my entire life. I found your glove, Eleanor said simply, and watched every trace of color drain further from her cousin's face. By the hidden inlet downstream from the old mill, exactly where a second boat came ashore that night, moving away from the bridge while I was still fighting to keep my head above the water. Your initials are embroidered on the cuff, Margaret. There is no explanation for how it came to be there that does not implicate you directly. The room had gone utterly silent now, every guest frozen in place, watching the unfolding confrontation with a mixture of horror and fascination. Margaret opened her mouth to respond, but before she could speak, Harold Finch rose abruptly from his seat, his chair scraping loudly against the floor. I had no part in this, he said, his voice cracking with barely controlled panic. Whatever she asked of me, whatever payments I made, I did not know her true intentions. I believed I was simply helping manage estate matters during a difficult time. You built her a boat in secret, Eleanor said, turning her attention fully toward him. Paid in coin, hidden from the estate's official records. A boat builder in Marsden has already confirmed as much, and will testify to the magistrate when he arrives within the week. Finch's composure shattered entirely at this revelation. It was her idea, he said quickly, pointing directly at Margaret, all pretense of loyalty abandoned in his desperation to save himself. She came to me months ago, said her cousin's inheritance rightfully belonged to her family, that Lady Ashworth's father had wronged her own branch of the family by leaving everything to a single daughter. She promised me a share of the fortune once it passed to her, enough to settle every debt I had accumulated and more besides. I only helped with the boat and the money afterward. I did not push anyone into that river. I swear it before everyone here tonight. Margaret's careful mask finally cracked entirely, fury and fear twisting her features into something Eleanor had never before seen on her cousin's face. You fool, she hissed at Finch. You would betray me so easily. After everything I promised you? I will not hang for a murder I did not commit with my own hands. Finch shot back, his voice rising with desperate intensity. Then whose hands committed it? The Duke asked quietly, rising slowly from his own seat, his voice carrying a cold authority that silenced the room once more. Margaret's eyes moved wildly around the table, searching for some escape from the trap closing around her, before finally settling into something like defeated resignation. It does not matter now, she said bitterly. You have already decided my guilt, all of you, based on a glove and a stolen boat and a frightened steward eager to save his own neck. Then tell us the truth, Eleanor said quietly. Tell everyone here exactly what happened that night, and perhaps some mercy might yet be found in how this matter is handled. Margaret was silent for a long moment, her hands trembling visibly now despite her best efforts to control them, before she finally spoke, her voice flat and hollow. Your father wronged my mother, she said. Passed over her in favor of his own daughter for the family's full inheritance, leaving my branch with scraps while you were raised to inherit everything. I watched you receive every advantage I was denied, watched you become engaged to a duke while I remained unmarried, and dependent on the charity of relatives who resented my presence. When the wedding date was set, I knew I would lose what small hope remained of ever correcting that unfairness. So yes, I arranged the outing on the river. Yes, I pushed you when you turned to look at the sky. And yes, I rode away believing the current would finish what I had started. The confession hung in the air, terrible and absolute, and Eleanor felt something complicated move through her, not triumph exactly, but a grim and exhausted relief that the truth had finally been spoken aloud, undeniable now before witnesses who could never claim it had been misunderstood or exaggerated. But even as relief settled over her, Eleanor's mind turned immediately to the questions that remained unanswered. Margaret had confessed to pushing her, to arranging the fatal outing, but the careful financial maneuvering, the debts settled with precision, the missing letters detailing her father's will, spoke of planning beyond what her cousin's bitter resentment alone could have accomplished. There is still the matter of the missing letters, Eleanor said, turning back to face Margaret directly. My father's will, taken from my trunk the very night I returned. You could not have taken them yourself, cousin. You were standing in the ballroom with the rest of the household when I first walked through those doors. Margaret's eyes flickered, something guarded returning to her expression despite her earlier confession. I do not know what you mean, she said, though her voice lacked the conviction of true ignorance. Someone searched my room before I ever reached it, Eleanor pressed. Someone who knew exactly which chamber would be prepared for me, and who had the freedom to move through the east wing without question. That describes very few people in this household, Margaret, and I do not believe it describes you. The room had grown tense again, the earlier shock of Margaret's confession giving way to a new and different kind of unease, as guests began glancing toward one another, wondering who among them might be implicated next. The Duke, still standing at the head of the table, turned slowly toward his sister, Lady Cordelia, who had remained silent throughout the entire confrontation, her wineglass untouched before her. Cordelia, the Duke said slowly, something dawning in his voice that Eleanor recognized as the same terrible realization she herself had begun to reach. You returned to Kestrel Hall the very afternoon Eleanor was brought back from the ballroom. You insisted on personally overseeing preparation of her chamber, said it would comfort her to find familiar touches waiting. Lady Cordelia's composure, far more practiced and controlled than Margaret's had ever been, began to show its first hairline cracks. I only wish to help, she said carefully. There is nothing sinister in preparing a room for a grieving guest. The letters, Eleanor said quietly, my father's will, detailing the exact terms of my inheritance. Only someone with reason to understand precisely how that inheritance might be redirected, someone with knowledge of estate law and financial structuring far beyond what Margaret or Harold Finch possessed between them, would have known those letters mattered enough to steal in the first place. Silence stretched taut across the room. Lady Cordelia's hands, Eleanor noticed, had begun to tremble faintly around the stem of her wineglass, the first crack in a composure that had otherwise remained flawless throughout the entire evening's unraveling. I have debts of my own, Cordelia said finally, her voice quiet but carrying clearly through the silent hall. Debts my brother knows nothing about, accumulated through certain unwise investments I made without his knowledge or approval. When Margaret came to me, months ago, seeking advice on how her family's claim to your father's fortune might be strengthened, I saw an opportunity to solve two problems at once. I helped her understand the legal structure of the will, showed her precisely which documents would need to disappear to create sufficient confusion in any inheritance dispute, and arranged for a portion of the funds, once secured, to quietly settle my own obligations. The Duke stared at his sister with an expression of such profound betrayal that Eleanor found she could not bear to watch it directly, turning her gaze instead toward Margaret, whose face had gone slack with the particular horror of a woman realizing she had been merely a tool in someone else's more calculated design all along. "You convinced me the plan was foolproof," Margaret said slowly, turning on Cordelia with sudden venom. "You said no one would ever question an accident on the river, that the shawl caught on the rocks would be evidence enough, that I need only wait for the fortune to transfer before anyone thought to look closer." "And it very nearly worked," Cordelia said coldly, any pretense of remorse vanishing from her voice entirely. "Had you not lost your nerve and hired that fool to build you a private boat through official channels traceable back to this house, we would not be standing here now having this conversation at all." The Duke's hand came down hard against the table, silencing both women at once, his face a mask of controlled fury that Eleanor had not yet seen from him in all the weeks since her return. "Enough," he said, his voice shaking with barely restrained anger. "My own sister, my own household, conspiring to murder the woman I intended to marry for nothing more than money that was never rightfully yours to claim." Eleanor watched him carefully in that moment, searching one final time for any sign that his shock and fury were performance rather than genuine feeling, and found, at last, complete certainty that he had known nothing of his sister's involvement until this very moment. Whatever doubts she had carried about the Duke's own innocence throughout these long weeks dissolved entirely, replaced by a quiet, aching sympathy for a man who had just learned his own family harbored the architect of such profound betrayal. "The magistrate arrives within the week," Eleanor said finally, breaking the heavy silence that had settled over the table. "I trust everyone here tonight understands the importance of ensuring neither Margaret nor Lady Cordelia has opportunity to flee or destroy further evidence before his arrival." The Duke nodded grimly, already turning to instruct the household staff to see both women confined to their chambers under careful watch, and as the dinner hall slowly emptied of guests too stunned to speak, Eleanor remained seated at the long table, staring at the ruined glove still resting before her, and felt the full weight of everything that had happened finally, quietly, begin to settle upon her shoulders. The magistrate arrived on a gray morning, 6 days after Margaret's confession had shattered the careful peace of Kestrel Hall. Eleanor watched his carriage approach from her window, a heavy-set man with sharp eyes and a reputation for thoroughness that had traveled ahead of him through the county, and felt a strange calm settle over her despite the significance of what the day would bring. The evidence had already been gathered, catalogued, and prepared. Samuel Pratt, the boat builder from Marsden, had arrived the previous evening and was staying quietly in the village inn, ready to give his testimony. Mrs. Whitfield had prepared a careful written account of everything she had observed in the weeks before Eleanor's disappearance. Elias, though hesitant to involve himself formally in matters so far removed from his simple life on the river, had agreed to testify to what he had witnessed the night he pulled Eleanor from the water. The questioning that followed took the better part of 2 days, conducted with a thoroughness that left little room for doubt or denial. Margaret, stripped of any hope that her confession might be dismissed or forgotten, offered little resistance to the magistrate's questions, answering each one with the flat, exhausted honesty of a woman who had already accepted the consequences of what she had done. Lady Cordelia proved more difficult, attempting several times to minimize her own involvement, insisting she had merely offered advice without truly believing Margaret intended violence, until Harold Finch's own testimony, corroborated by the boat builder's account and the physical evidence of the glove and rope, made such claims impossible to sustain. Eleanor gave her own testimony on the second afternoon, recounting the night of the accident with careful precision, describing the hand that had pushed her, the cold shock of the water, the desperate fight to keep her head above the current until Elias found her in the darkness. She spoke of waking in the fisherman's cottage, of the weeks spent healing in secret, of her decision to walk back into that ballroom rather than send word ahead and risk whoever had tried to kill her learning of her survival before she was ready to confront them. "Why did you not go directly to the authorities upon your recovery?" the magistrate asked, his sharp eyes studying her carefully, "rather than returning in such a dramatic and, if I may say, dangerous manner?" Eleanor considered the question seriously before answering. "Because I did not yet know who I could trust," she said. "I did not know if the person who pushed me held influence over the local authorities, or whether coming forward too soon might simply give them opportunity to finish what they had started, before any proof could be gathered against them. I chose instead to watch, and wait, and gather evidence carefully enough that when I finally did speak, no one could dismiss my account as confusion or grief-driven imagination." The magistrate nodded slowly, something like respect entering his expression. "A dangerous strategy, Lady Ashworth, but I confess I understand your reasoning. Had you gone directly to us with nothing but your own account and no corroborating evidence, I fear the matter might have proven considerably harder to prosecute. By the end of the second day, the magistrate had heard enough to formally charge both Margaret and Lady Cordelia with conspiracy and attempted murder, while Harold Finch, whose cooperation and testimony had proven invaluable to the case, faced lesser charges related to the concealment of funds and his role in facilitating the crime, though his eventual sentence would be considerably softened by his willingness to speak the full truth once confronted. Before the magistrate departed that evening to prepare the formal charges, he requested one final private conversation with Eleanor, meeting her in the quiet of the estate library where the fire burned low against the evening chill. "I have handled a great many difficult cases in my years serving this county," he said, settling into the chair across from her with the weary posture of a man who had spent 2 long days sorting truth from desperate denial. "Few have troubled me as deeply as this one, Lady Ashworth, not merely for the cruelty involved, though that alone would be enough, but for how nearly it succeeded. Had you not survived that river, had the fishermen not found you in time, this entire conspiracy might never have come to light at all. Your cousin and Lady Cordelia would have simply inherited what they schemed to obtain, and no one would have ever known the truth of how it was achieved." "That thought has occurred to me as well," Eleanor admitted quietly, "more often than I would like to confess." "Then take some comfort in this," the magistrate said, rising to take his leave. "Justice was not achieved through luck alone, though luck certainly played its part in your survival. It was achieved because you refused to accept the comfortable fiction others were prepared to believe, and because you had the courage and patience to gather proof rather than simply making accusations you could not support. That is no small thing, my lady. Many in your position, having survived such an ordeal, would have wanted nothing more than to retreat from danger entirely, to let others handle the pursuit of justice. You chose instead to face it directly, and the county owes you a debt of gratitude for that courage, whether or not it is ever properly acknowledged." Eleanor found herself moved by his words more than she expected, and thanked him quietly before he departed into the gathering darkness, his carriage carrying him back toward the county seat, where the formal proceedings against Margaret and Lady Cordelia would soon begin in earnest. As the magistrate's carriage departed Kestrel Hall 3 days later, carrying both women toward the county courts where they would await formal trial, Eleanor stood beside the Duke on the front steps of the great house, and watched until the carriage disappeared around the bend in the road. Neither of them spoke for a long while, the silence between them carrying the weight of everything that had happened in the weeks since Eleanor's dramatic return. "I do not know how to begin rebuilding trust with what remains of my family," the Duke said finally, his voice quiet and raw in a way Eleanor had not heard from him before. "My sister, my own sister Eleanor, willing to see you murdered for the sake of settling her own debts. I have spent every night since her confession wondering how I failed to notice what she was capable of, wondering what else about my own household I have failed to see clearly." "You cannot blame yourself for another person's choices," Eleanor said gently. "Cordelia made her own decisions, weighed her own debts against my life, and chose as she did. That failure belongs to her alone, not to you. And yet I wonder," the Duke said, "whether you can ever fully trust me again, knowing what grew unchecked within my own household while I remained blind to it." Eleanor considered the question carefully, turning it over in her mind with the same careful deliberation she had applied to every piece of evidence gathered over the preceding weeks. She thought of the warning letter he had shown her without hesitation, the moment he had learned of the boat's threat and moved immediately to protect her rather than dismiss her concerns, the grief and fury on his face when Cordelia's involvement had finally come to light, grief and fury too raw and immediate to have been performance. "I believe," she said slowly, "that trust is not something destroyed entirely by one person's betrayal within a household, provided the person standing beside you proves, through action rather than mere words, that he is not the same as those who betrayed us both. You have done nothing these past weeks but seek the truth alongside me, even when that truth led to devastating discoveries about your own family. That counts for a great deal in my estimation." The Duke turned to look at her fully then, something hopeful flickering behind the exhaustion in his eyes. "Then you do not intend to end our engagement," he said, "despite everything that has happened?" Eleanor allowed herself a small, tired smile, the first genuine one she had permitted herself in longer than she could easily recall. "I intend to move forward carefully," she said, "rebuilding what trust remains between us, slowly and honestly, rather than pretending the events of these past weeks never happened. But no, I do not intend to end our engagement. I have found, through everything that has happened, that I trust you more now than I did before I ever walked back into that ballroom, precisely because I have watched you choose truth over comfortable ignorance, even when that truth cost you dearly. In the weeks that followed, life at Kestrel Hall began slowly returning to something resembling normalcy, though the household would never entirely forget the events of that autumn. Mrs. Whitfield, whose quiet loyalty and careful observations had proven instrumental in uncovering the truth, was elevated to a position of greater trust and responsibility within the estate, her counsel sought regularly by both Eleanor and the Duke on matters both large and small. Elias, too, found his life changed in ways he had never anticipated when he first pulled a drowning woman from the cold waters of the Calder. Eleanor, determined to properly repay the debt she owed him, arranged for him to be granted a small parcel of land along the river, along with sufficient funds to expand his modest fishing operation into something more substantial. He accepted the gift with characteristic reluctance, insisting he required no reward for simply doing what any decent person would have done, though Eleanor noticed he visited Kestrel Hall with increasing frequency in the months that followed, ostensibly to discuss the management of his new land, though their conversations often drifted toward subjects far removed from fishing or farming. In the weeks between the magistrate's departure and the eventual trial, Eleanor found herself confronting a quieter kind of reckoning within Kestrel Hall itself, one that had nothing to do with courtrooms or formal charges. The household staff, many of whom had served the family for years, moved through their duties with a subdued caution, uncertain how to reconcile the warmth they had once felt toward Margaret with the horror of what she had done. Eleanor made a point of speaking personally with each of them, thanking those who had quietly supported her during the difficult weeks of investigation, and offering what reassurance she could to those who simply needed to hear that the danger had truly passed. She also found time, in those quieter weeks, to write a long letter to her father's memory, though she never intended it for any eyes but her own. In it, she set down everything that had happened since the night of the river, not as a formal account for the magistrate, or a story to be shared in drawing rooms, but as a private reckoning with grief, fear, and the strange, hard-won peace that had followed. She wrote of missing him more acutely than she had in the years since his passing, wishing she could have asked him directly what he had truly intended when he structured his will as he did, whether he had ever suspected the resentment simmering within his brother's branch of the family, or whether the entire tragedy had grown from seeds he never knew he had planted. She sealed the letter and placed it in the same trunk that had once hidden his stolen papers, a private testament to everything she had survived, and found, in the act of writing it, a measure of closure she had not expected to feel so soon. The wedding, delayed by months due to the scandal and subsequent legal proceedings, finally took place on a bright morning the following spring, in a ceremony considerably smaller and quieter than the grand affair originally planned before Eleanor's disappearance had upended every careful arrangement. Eleanor wore a simple gown rather than the elaborate silk originally commissioned for the occasion, finding she preferred, after everything she had endured, the kind of quiet elegance that did not call attention to itself. Standing before the assembled guests, considerably fewer in number than the crowd that had once gathered to hear the Duke announce her death, Eleanor found herself thinking not of the terror of that night in the river, nor of the careful, patient work of uncovering the truth that followed, but simply of the strange and unexpected path that had led her from cold water and betrayal to this quiet morning, standing beside a man who had proven, through every difficult revelation, that he deserved the trust she had been so reluctant to offer. Margaret and Lady Cordelia's trial concluded just weeks before the wedding, both women found guilty of conspiracy and attempted murder, their sentences severe enough to remove them permanently from the society that had once welcomed them so warmly. Harold Finch, having cooperated fully throughout the proceedings, received a considerably lighter sentence, though his career and reputation lay in ruins regardless, a fitting consequence, Eleanor thought, for a man who had chosen personal gain over basic decency when the opportunity presented itself. In the years that followed, Eleanor often found herself returning to the river where her ordeal had begun, not out of any morbid fascination with the danger she had survived, but because the quiet water had become, in its own strange way, a place of peace rather than fear. She would walk the familiar path to the small cottage where Elias had nursed her back to health, sometimes bringing her own children along as they grew older, teaching them to skip stones across the current, and explaining, in careful and age-appropriate terms, why their mother held such deep gratitude for the river that had so nearly taken everything from her. The Duke, for his part, never again allowed himself the comfortable ignorance that had permitted his sister's betrayal to grow unnoticed within his own household. He took a far more active role in managing the estate's affairs, personally reviewing accounts that he had once left entirely to stewards and advisors, determined never again to be blindsided by deception growing unchecked beneath his own roof. The lesson had cost him dearly, both in the loss of his sister and in the painful reckoning with his own blindness, but he carried it forward as a kind of quiet wisdom that shaped every decision he made in the years that followed. Eleanor, for her part, never fully lost the careful watchfulness that her ordeal had instilled in her, though it softened over time into something less like fear and more like wisdom, a quiet understanding that trust, once broken, could be rebuilt only through patient, consistent action, rather than mere words or apologies. She had walked into that ballroom once believing herself already dead in the eyes of the world, and had emerged from the experience not diminished by what she survived, but strengthened by it, carrying forward a clarity of purpose and quiet courage that would serve her well through every challenge the years ahead would bring. And though the story of her return to Kestrel Hall would be whispered about in society drawing rooms for years to come, embellished and exaggerated with each retelling, until the truth grew difficult to separate from legend, Eleanor herself remained, through it all, simply grateful for the fisherman's steady hands that had pulled her from the water, for the housekeeper's quiet loyalty that had helped uncover the truth, and for a duke who had proven, when it mattered most, that he was worthy of the trust she had once been so reluctant to give him again. On quiet evenings long after the scandal had faded from common gossip and the household had settled into its new and steadier rhythm, Eleanor would sometimes stand at the window of her chamber, looking out over the gardens toward the distant glint of the river beyond the tree line, and think of the young woman who had once hidden trembling in a servant's corridor, listening to her own funeral being spoken aloud by the man she loved. That woman had believed, in her darkest moment, that she had lost everything, her safety, her trust in those closest to her, perhaps even her own life. Standing now in the same house, surrounded by a family rebuilt from the wreckage of betrayal, Eleanor understood that survival alone had never been the true victory. The victory lay in what she had chosen to do with that survival, the patience and courage it had taken to seek truth over comfortable silence, and the quiet, hard-won peace that had finally settled over Kestrel Hall in the long season that followed. 2 years after the wedding, a letter arrived at Kestrel Hall bearing a seal Eleanor had hoped never to see again. It came from the prison where Margaret had been serving her sentence, and Eleanor turned it over in her hands for a long while before deciding to open it, uncertain whether she wished to hear whatever her cousin might have to say after so much time and silence between them. The Duke found her still holding it, unopened, in the morning room, and offered quietly to sit with her while she read it, an offer she accepted gratefully. The letter, when she finally opened it, contained none of the manipulation or careful performance Eleanor had once come to expect from her cousin. Margaret wrote plainly, almost humbly, of the long months of confinement, of time spent reflecting on choices that could never be undone, and of a genuine, if late, understanding of the harm she had caused. She did not ask for forgiveness outright, seeming to understand that such a request would be presumptuous given everything Eleanor had suffered, but she expressed a hope that Eleanor might someday find peace with what had happened, not for Margaret's sake, but for her own. Eleanor read the letter twice, then set it aside, uncertain how to feel. The Duke, watching her carefully, asked gently whether she intended to respond. "I do not know yet," Eleanor admitted. "Part of me wishes to simply leave the past where it belongs, undisturbed, but another part wonders whether some small correspondence, carefully bounded, might offer a kind of closure neither of us has fully found." In the weeks that followed, Eleanor composed a brief reply, not warm exactly, but not entirely cold either, acknowledging Margaret's letter and stating plainly that while she could not yet offer forgiveness, she did not wish to carry bitterness forward into whatever years remained for either of them. It was, she felt, an honest answer, neither more nor less than what she truly believed. Life at Kestrel Hall, meanwhile, had settled into a rhythm far removed from the danger and deception of that first terrible autumn. Eleanor had given birth to a daughter the previous winter, a small, fierce child with her father's dark eyes and, according to Mrs. Whitfield, her mother's stubborn determination, already evident even in infancy. The estate itself had prospered under the Duke's more attentive management. The financial irregularities that had once allowed Cordelia's schemes to flourish, now caught quickly by careful oversight established in the aftermath of the scandal. Elias had become, in the years since Eleanor's ordeal, something between a trusted friend and an honorary member of the household. His modest fishing operation grown into a respected local business, his advice sought regularly on matters concerning the river and the tenants who lived along its banks. He had married, the previous autumn, a kind and practical woman from the village who had listened with patient interest to the full story of his role in Eleanor's survival, and who had come to regard the strange bond between the fisherman and the lady of Kestrel Hall with amused affection rather than any jealousy. It was Elias, in fact, who brought news one autumn afternoon that stirred old memories Eleanor had believed largely settled. He arrived at the house with unusual urgency, asking to speak with her privately, and once alone in the garden, explained that a stranger had come asking questions in the village, questions about the events of that long-ago autumn, about the river, about Lady Ashworth's dramatic return from presumed death. A journalist, Elias explained, writing some manner of account for a London publication. He seemed to already know a great deal, more than idle gossip alone would explain, and asked me directly whether I would be willing to share my own part in the story. Eleanor considered this news carefully. The scandal had, of course, become widely known throughout society in the years since Margaret's trial, but the details had remained largely confined to court records and the kind of exaggerated gossip that faded with time. A published account, written for wide circulation, would revive the entire matter in the public eye, forcing Eleanor and the Duke to relive publicly what they had worked so hard to move beyond privately. "Did you agree to speak with him?" she asked. "I told him I would need to consult with you first," Elias said. "It is your story to tell or withhold, my lady, not mine to give away without your blessing." Eleanor discussed the matter that evening with the Duke, weighing the discomfort of renewed public attention against a consideration that had not initially occurred to her. "Perhaps," she said slowly, "there is some value in the truth being told properly, rather than left to grow more distorted with each year that passes in gossip and rumor. If someone intends to write of what happened regardless, would it not be better for the account to be accurate, drawn from those who actually lived through it, rather than invented or exaggerated by those who did not?" The Duke considered this thoughtfully. "It is your choice to make," he said. "I will support whatever you decide, but I confess I understand the appeal of setting the record straight, difficult as it might be to revisit." In the end, Eleanor agreed to a single, carefully controlled interview, conducted in the privacy of Kestrel Hall's own library, in which she recounted the essential facts of what had happened, without embellishment or omission. She spoke of the river, of Elias's rescue, of the careful weeks of investigation that had followed, and of the trial that had finally brought justice for what had nearly cost her life. She did not dwell on Margaret's motives or offer excuses for what her cousin had done, but she also did not shy away from acknowledging the complicated grief she still carried, knowing that someone she had once loved as a sister had been capable of such betrayal. The resulting account, published some months later, proved surprisingly measured and respectful, capturing the essential truth of what had happened, without the sensationalism Eleanor had feared. She read it once, in the quiet of her own study, and found that seeing the story finally told plainly and accurately, free of the wild speculation that had circulated for years, brought a genuine and unexpected relief. Mrs. Whitfield, now well established as the most trusted figure in the entire household's daily management, read the published account with visible pride, remarking that she had always known Eleanor possessed a strength few people ever fully recognized. "You were always too clever for the river, my lady," she said again, echoing the words she had first spoken on the night of Eleanor's dramatic return, "and clever enough, it seems, to outlast everyone who ever doubted you." Eleanor found herself smiling at the memory of that first frightened, uncertain night, so different from the settled confidence she carried now. She thought often, in quiet moments, of how far she had traveled from the young woman crouched trembling in a servant's corridor, listening to her own eulogy spoken by a man she had not yet learned to trust. That woman had survived through patience, careful observation, and a refusal to accept comfortable lies over difficult truths. The woman she had become carried those same qualities forward, tempered now by years of hard-won peace rather than constant vigilance. Harold Finch, she had learned through occasional correspondence with the magistrate's office, had served his considerably shortened sentence and left the county entirely upon his release, seeking work in a distant part of the country where his name carried no weight of scandal. Eleanor felt little beyond a distant, weary indifference toward his fate, understanding that whatever justice he had received matched fairly with his own choices, made not out of the deep resentment that had driven Margaret, but out of simple, short-sighted greed. Lady Cordelia, whose sentence had proven longer and harsher than Margaret's given her greater role in orchestrating the conspiracy, had written no letters of reflection or apology in the years since her conviction. The Duke visited her only once, early in her imprisonment, and returned from that visit changed in ways he rarely spoke of afterward, though Eleanor understood, without needing him to explain, that whatever remained of the bond between brother and sister had been permanently and irrevocably severed by what she had done. As the seasons turned and their daughter grew from an unsteady toddler into a curious, quick-witted child who asked endless questions about everything from the stars overhead to the fish in the river below, Eleanor found herself telling her, in careful and age-appropriate fragments, the story of the fisherman who had once saved her mother's life. She never spoke of the darker details, the betrayal or the trial, believing such heavy truths belonged to a later age than her daughter had yet reached. But she made certain the child understood, from her earliest years, the value of patience, of careful observation, and of choosing truth even when comfortable silence might prove easier. That winter, as snow settled over the grounds of Kestrel Hall and the household gathered for the quiet celebrations of the season, Eleanor found herself standing once more at the window of her chamber, watching her young daughter play in the garden below, under the watchful eye of her nursemaid, bundled against the cold in a small woolen coat that made her look, Eleanor thought with quiet amusement, rather like a determined little snowball navigating the drifts. The Duke joined her at the window, wrapping an arm gently around her shoulders as they watched together. "Do you ever think of that night still?" he asked quietly. "The ballroom, the announcement, everything that followed?" "Sometimes," Eleanor admitted, "less often now than before, and when I do think of it, the fear has mostly faded, replaced by something closer to simple memory. It happened. It shaped who I became, but it no longer holds the power over me it once did." "I am glad," the Duke said simply, and Eleanor found, standing there in the gentle warmth of the winter afternoon, that she believed him completely, without the careful, guarded doubt that had once colored every interaction between them in the difficult weeks after her return. Below in the garden, their daughter tumbled happily into a snowdrift, laughing with the pure, uncomplicated joy of a child who knew nothing yet of rivers or betrayal or the long, hard journey her mother had walked to secure the peaceful, ordinary life now unfolding before them both. Eleanor watched her for a long moment, then turned back to the Duke beside her, and found that the quiet contentment settling over her in that moment was worth every difficult step of the path that had led her there. The story of the woman who walked alive into her own funeral would be told and retold for years afterward, in drawing rooms and taverns and, eventually, in the pages of a carefully written account that captured, as closely as such things ever could, the truth of what had happened. But for Eleanor herself, the story had long since become simply her life, woven through with grief and fear, certainly, but also with courage, loyalty, and the hard-won, quiet happiness of a woman who had refused to let betrayal define the years that followed it.